Judy Garland was the kind of name that, the moment it was spoken, instantly brought to mind bright lights, movie musicals, and a voice that once softened the whole of America. But the more closely one looks at her life, the more it becomes clear that this is not simply the story of a Hollywood legend. It is the story of a woman who spent her entire life singing about hope, while living among fractures that never truly closed. That was also the most haunting paradox of Judy Garland. The whole world remembered her as the girl from The Wizard of Oz, as the one who sang over the rainbow with all the innocence and faith a heart could pour into music. That voice made millions believe that after the storm, there would still be a gentle place to return to. But behind that symbol was a life stretched thin between fame and exhaustion, between applause and loneliness, between the radiant image Hollywood wanted to preserve and the real human being quietly growing weary beneath it. And perhaps the greatest question was never how famous Judy Garland became. It was this: why could a woman sing so beautifully about the rainbow and yet never truly reach it? Before the world came to know the name Judy Garland, she was simply a little girl named Frances Gumm, born on June 10, 1922, in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. But even from that very beginning, her life was never going to follow an ordinary path. Judy did not grow up in a home far removed from the stage, only to one day accidentally dream of the spotlight. On the contrary, the spotlight was already there, almost as if it had been waiting for her all along. Her parents worked in vaudeville, managing a movie house and performance space, so music, applause, and the atmosphere of the stage were almost a natural part of her childhood. Judy stepped onto the stage when she was only 2.5 years old. At an age when many children had not yet begun to understand the world around them, she was already learning how to stand before strangers, how to be noticed, how to make other people smile. And perhaps that is what is both beautiful and heartbreaking about childhoods shaped by old Hollywood. Because when a child is loved too early for knowing how to perform, a quiet fear can easily begin to grow alongside that love. If one day I can no longer move people, will I still be worthy of being loved? Judy belonged to that kind of childhood, glittering yet fragile, seen very early but not necessarily understood. And the more one looks back, the more it seems that she belonged to the stage before she ever had the chance to belong to herself. Then came the early 1930s, and Frances Gumm was no longer just a little girl singing on her family's stage. Her talent began to travel far beyond those small spaces, and by 1932, her name had already been noticed by Variety as that of a standout teenage vocalist. 2 years later, in 1934, the name Judy Garland officially appeared. Shorter, brighter, easier to remember, and carrying the unmistakable feeling of a new version of herself being created to enter the world of entertainment. Then, in September 1935, Judy signed with MGM, one of the most powerful star-making machines in Hollywood at the time. From the outside, it looked like the door every dream led to. For so many young girls, being chosen by MGM was almost the same as being called by destiny itself. But for Judy Garland, it was also the moment when the spotlight began to come with a very specific price. MGM did not simply see in her a young girl with an extraordinary voice. They saw a form that could be shaped, a future star who could be altered, arranged, and packaged to fit the silver screen dream Hollywood wanted to sell to the public. Judy did not fit the standard beauty mold of the leading ladies of her time, and that alone caused her to be scrutinized more harshly. Her body, her face, her weight, her clothes, the way she appeared, even the rhythm of her daily life, everything gradually became something to be controlled. For many classic stars, Hollywood offered opportunity. For Judy Garland, Hollywood offered opportunity, but at the same time, it also designed the pressure that came with it. She was chosen, but she was never allowed to simply be herself. Perhaps it was during this period that Judy first began to touch a very cold truth. inside the studio system, being loved did not mean being protected. It was here that the first quiet seeds of dependence and exhaustion were planted. And then, in 1939, the greatest opportunity of Judy Garland's life arrived. But with it, an image that would follow her for the rest of her life also began to be born. When The Wizard of Oz premiered in 1939, Judy Garland didn't just land the role of a lifetime. She was almost permanently etched into the memory of America as Dorothy, with those clear, luminous eyes, a sincere heart, and the belief that beyond every storm, there would always be a place to return to. It wasn't just a successful performance, it was a cultural symbol, born at exactly the moment when the public needed to believe in gentleness, in kindness, and in the idea that some kind of magic still existed. Then, Over the Rainbow rose, and Judy did something very few artists ever achieve. She didn't just sing a beautiful song. She made millions feel as though it belonged to them, as if each person carried their own rainbow to hope for, to hold on to keep going. That role would later earn her the Juvenile Academy Award, but perhaps the greatest and heaviest reward was that from that moment on, she was no longer just a young girl full of promise. She became the face of hope, and that was also the first paradox, deeply beautiful yet quietly heartbreaking, in Judy Garland's life. The more she became a symbol of hope for others, the further her own life drifted from the peace that Over the Rainbow seemed to promise. After 1939, Judy no longer had the freedom to fail in an ordinary way. Early success didn't just lift her to great heights. It locked her image into a dream that, for the rest of her life, she would both depend on and never fully escape. Every time you look at Judy in The Wizard of Oz, it doesn't feel like you're simply watching a legend begin. It feels more like watching a very young girl being embraced by the entire world, while at the same time being asked far too much by it. After The Wizard of Oz, Judy Garland entered a period that, from the outside, seemed to be following the most radiant path Hollywood could possibly promise. From the late 1930s through the 1940s, she appeared continuously in a string of musical films, especially those alongside Mickey Rooney, and gradually became one of MGM's most familiar young faces. Audiences loved her not only for her voice, but for something harder to define, an energy that felt warm, sincere, and as if it could always reach straight into the heart of whoever was watching. By 1944, Meet Me in St. Louis was released and further solidified Judy's place as a true major star. A year later, in 1945, she married director Vincente Minnelli and later gave birth to her daughter, Liza Minnelli, who would, in time, become a major entertainment icon in her own very distinct way. If one looked only at those milestones, it would have been easy to believe that Judy Garland was living the Hollywood dream in full. Fame, successful films, marriage, family, bright lights, and the love of the public. But the deeper one goes into this period, the clearer it becomes that behind all that brilliance was a rhythm of life that almost never allowed her the right to weaken. Judy had to work constantly, maintain her image, maintain her weight, maintain her energy, and even maintain the impression that she was always ready to glow the moment the cameras began to roll. The public saw a star growing bigger and bigger. What they did not see was the cost of having to shine too early and for too long. There was in Judy a sadness that felt profoundly Hollywood. On the outside, there was music, gowns, film sets, and applause. On the inside, there was a human being increasingly forced to live on strength that seemed borrowed from her own body. The more admired she became, the more exhausted she seemed to grow. And perhaps this, too, was one of the quietest paradoxes in an artist's life. Some people do not collapse because of failure. They collapse because success comes too early, too powerfully, and lasts too long for the person inside to keep pace with the image the world demands they preserve. For Judy Garland, the early years of her peak were not merely the most beautiful chapter of her life. They were also the moment when the first cracks began to form, small, hidden, almost invisible, yet deep enough that one day they could no longer be concealed. And then, those cracks truly began to show. They followed her into the late 1940s, quietly shifting from something that once held her up into something that was now wearing her down from within. Judy Garland did not collapse in a single moment. There was no one day when her life suddenly split in two. What happened to Judy was slower, longer, and for that very reason far more terrifying. It was a prolonged process of erosion. Sleepless nights, work days stretched beyond endurance, the pressure to keep her body within standards defined by others, a mind growing more and more unstable, and a dependence on medication as a way to force herself to keep functioning. Pills to stay awake, pills to sleep, pills to keep pace, pills to get up and face one more day as though everything were still under control. From the outside, the public may have seen only a star beginning to struggle more on set. But from the inside, this was the point when Judy was hardly allowed to live like a real human being anymore. She was not simply tired. She was living with the feeling of being constantly demanded, constantly pulled, constantly needed, while the deepest part of her had no time to heal, to rest, or even to breathe. By the end of the 1940s, that exhaustion had become so visible that Judy was having increasing difficulty finishing films, repeatedly struggling to keep up with the working rhythm the studio system demanded of her. And it was here that one of Hollywood's coldest truths revealed itself most clearly. It was a place extraordinarily skilled at creating legends, but rarely patient enough to hold the broken parts of those legends once they began to fall apart. When Judy was still shining in the right way at the right pace, with the kind of light MGM could put on the screen, she was a priceless asset. But when she began to slow down, to grow weary, to no longer meet the brutal pace of that machine, the very system that had lifted her up began to step back. MGM ended her contract earlier than expected, and that was not merely a business decision. For Judy, it felt more like a devastating confirmation of something deeply painful. When she was at her weakest, the place that had profited most from her talent was no longer gentle enough to keep her. If one sees Judy Garland only as a story of addiction or breakdown, then the story becomes far too shallow. What is far more haunting is the sense that she was already exhausted during the very years that should have been the most beautiful of her life. Not after the spotlight had faded, but while it was still shining directly on her. After everything that had worn her down by the end of the 1940s, what was remarkable was not simply that she was still there, but that she was able to return with such power. In 1954, Judy appeared in A Star is Born, and that return did not feel like an ordinary Hollywood comeback. It did not arrive wrapped in glamour, did not come through polished freshness, and certainly did not carry the illusion that nothing had ever been broken. Judy returned carrying everything life had left on her: experience, fatigue, wounds that had settled into her eyes, her voice, and even the silences between her lines. That performance earned her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, but what kept audiences from looking away was not the acting alone. What held them was the feeling that they were no longer watching a movie star perform suffering, but a woman who truly understood what pain looked like. Some comebacks leave people stunned by their brilliance. Judy Garland was different. She left people silent because of the truth she carried. A Star is Born seemed to mirror her own life. The light, the damage, the fragility, and the price a person pays for living too long under the pressure to keep shining. By this stage, Judy was no longer just a film star. She had become an artist in whose face, voice, and every gesture people could see an entire life already lived. And perhaps sometimes the most beautiful thing about an artist is not found when they are at their most perfect. It is found when they have already cracked, already grown weary, yet still step before the public and turn those very wounds into a different kind of light, deeper, sadder, but so true that it cannot be forgotten. And if Hollywood was no longer the place Judy Garland fully belonged to, then the live stage was gradually becoming the place where she was most fully herself. And then came a night when the whole world was almost forced to see Judy Garland through different eyes. No longer as the teenage Dorothy, no longer as the golden girl of the studio era. On the night of April 23, 1961, at Carnegie Hall, Judy stepped onto the stage as a woman who had already lived through far too many collisions with life. And because of that, she seemed greater, deeper, and more real than ever before. The audience that night did not come merely to hear a star sing. They came to witness something far rarer, an artist turning all of her pain, exhaustion, and uneven years into living art. Judy no longer sang like someone trying to preserve a flawless image. She sang like someone who understood exactly how pain settles into the voice, into the breath, and even into the silences between one line and the next. Perhaps that is why the performance was not merely a success. It became legend. The recording Judy at Carnegie Hall later became the biggest-selling album of her career and won multiple Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. There is something unforgettable about looking at this peak in Judy Garland's life. Perhaps she did not come closest to immortality when she was at her youngest, but when she was at her most weary and still had the power to leave an entire hall in absolute silence. From that moment on, Judy was no longer Hollywood's polished creation. She became proof that the greatest art is sometimes born from a life that is anything but perfect. And from here, Judy's familiar tragedy revealed itself once again. Every time she reached a new peak, her body and her private life seemed less and less able to keep pace. But the tragedy of Judy Garland was that every time she reached a new height, her body and private life seemed less and less able to keep pace. After Carnegie Hall, she was still there, still capable of moving an audience. But as the 1960s began, the light around Judy no longer carried the feeling of triumph. It began to carry the feeling of endurance. In 1963 to 1964, Judy had her own program, The Judy Garland Show. It should have been a sign that she was still important enough for American television to build an entire stage around her. But the show lasted only 26 episodes in a single season before it was canceled, even though it still revealed a Judy who was immensely powerful on stage. From that point on, the final years of her life should not be told as a chain of scandals. It felt more like a slow draining away. Unstable finances, a private life marked by repeated heartbreak, physical and emotional health growing more fragile, and yet she still had to keep performing in America and then in England, as though the stage remained the only place she still knew how to hold on to in order to survive. General biographies all note that she continued working and performing in England through the second half of the 1960s, right up until the end of her life. The closer Judy moved toward her final years, the feeling she left behind was not scandal, but weariness. A weariness that lasted, beautiful, but painful. There were times when she married again, still trying to rebuild some sense of home, of being loved, of beginning again. But after everything, the image that remained most clearly was still that of a woman always trying to keep herself standing just a little longer. One more performance, one more trip, one more time stepping out before an audience as though she was still all right. And then, on June 22, 1969, Judy Garland died in London from an accidental barbiturate overdose, less than 2 weeks after her 47th birthday. Her funeral in New York drew around 22,000 mourners who came to say goodbye. But the tragedy here was not only the death itself. The tragedy was the gradual emptying out that came before it. A woman who had once carried the emotions of so many others finally no longer had enough space left to hold herself up. And perhaps that is where Judy Garland touched a truth that still feels painfully modern. Fame does not heal loneliness. So after everything, what did Judy Garland leave behind? A legend, a warning, or a profoundly human reflection of the price of being born to shine? Judy Garland left behind far more than a collection of great roles or songs woven into the memory of American cinema. The Wizard of Oz, Meet Me in St. Louis, A Star is Born, and Judy at Carnegie Hall all remain there as milestones forever bound to her name. The moment Judy Garland is mentioned, people still remember a voice that could bring an entire room to silence, a face that could seem fragile and radiant at once, and a presence that time has never truly managed to erase. But perhaps what has endured even longer than her achievements lives somewhere else. It lives in the way Judy made people understand that behind a voice capable of lifting the emotions of millions, there could still be a heart that had been tired for a very long time. She once sang about somewhere over the rainbow, as if at the far edge of sorrow, there really was a place of peace waiting. But looking back on her whole life, perhaps the greatest legacy Judy Garland left behind was never an ideal place at the end of the rainbow. What she left instead was a truth far harder to forget. Sometimes the very artists who give the world its most beautiful hope are the ones who have lived closest to the darkness. For that reason, Judy Garland remains more than just a Hollywood legend. She endures as a beautiful and painful paradox, as a reminder that great art is sometimes born from the most fragile human beings. And perhaps that is why, even today, people do not remember Judy Garland only for how beautifully she sang, but for how she lived, how much she endured, and how she turned all of it into a light that could never be replaced. In your view, what is the truest source of Judy Garland's immortality? Her voice, the fragility within her, or the way she turned pain into art? Leave your thoughts below.